From the frozen steppes of Thrace, at the very edge of what Rome considered civilization, to the sun-drenched campaign fields where wealth and wine flowed endlessly, there lived a man whose entire life mocked the absolute power of the empire. He was the slave who became a gladiator, the gladiator who rose to be a general, and the general who shook the very foundations of the Roman Republic. His name was Spartacus. For centuries, the world has glorified conquerors, Caesars, and emperors, those who built their empires upon the subjugation of millions. But there's a more raw and, frankly, more epic story to be told. It's the story of a man who dared to say no to the most efficient machine of slavery and war the ancient world had ever known. Imagine, for a moment, a desperate escape. 70 men armed with kitchen knives and roasting spits fleeing a gladiator school in Capua, 70 against the might of Rome. It sounds like utter madness. And it was, but it was the spark that ignited the Third Servile War, the most destructive of its kind. This was the only time in history where an army of slaves, men stripped of everything, were able to repeatedly defeat the seemingly invincible Roman legions. This isn't just a recounting of battles, it's a deep dive into the mind of a leader who refused to be a king. He sought only to return his men to freedom beyond the Alps, only to be dragged back into an unequal fight by those who knew nothing but vengeance. We're going to unravel why Spartacus never crossed the Alps, explore the sheer brutality of Marcus Licinius Crassus, and understand the terror the Roman Senate felt as they watched this scourge roam freely through Italy. It was a story that concluded with a chilling and atrocious message: 6,000 crucified along 200 kilometers of the Appian Way. A message that, ironically, elevated Spartacus from man to myth. Prepare yourselves, because what you're about to witness is not just history. It's an epic clash between total oppression and the indomitable dream of freedom. It's the life and legacy of a man who proved that Rome's greatest power wasn't its legions, but its fear. Don't go anywhere, because this story begins, ironically, at the peak of the Republic's splendor and arrogance. Before you settle in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the globe. I'm the Night Historian, and my goal is to immerse you in a unique experience as you drift off to sleep. We're in the year 73 BC. If history were a mountain, Rome would be standing right at its summit, at the absolute peak of its expansion and arrogance. But if you zoom in and look closely, you'll realize that this summit is completely riddled from within. The Roman Republic, that supposedly immutable and venerable political structure, is on the brink of collapse. The preceding century, the century of crisis, had been a political and social minefield. Imagine the Republic as an old man with a weak heart, struggling to manage a body that keeps growing uncontrollably. Rome had conquered the entire Mediterranean, from Hispania to Asia, but this massive wealth only served to create fierce divisions within Italy itself. In the late 2nd and early 1st centuries BC, the streets of Rome were as dangerous and volatile as a powder keg. We're not talking about tavern brawls, but brutal civil wars between factions that murdered each other in the forum for power. It all began with the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, who attempted to reform the agrarian system and distribute land to poor citizens. An idea that, though just, ended with both of them assassinated by the conservative elite. This opened the floodgates. Political violence became institutionalized. If you didn't like what your opponent was doing, you simply had them massacred in the streets. This climate of chaos allowed for the meteoric rise of powerful generals, men who realized something fundamental. A soldier's loyalty was no longer to the Senate or the Republic, but to the man who paid them, to their leader. Think of Gaius Marius, a military genius who reformed the army, making soldiers swear allegiance to him, not to the state. And of course, we can't forget Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the most bloodthirsty dictator Rome had ever seen, who systematically massacred his opponents in what became known as the proscriptions, filling the state coffers and his own with the fortunes of the executed. When Spartacus rises up in 73 BC, Rome has only just emerged from Sulla's dictatorship. The terror has subsided a bit, but the wounds are still open, and real power is concentrated in the hands of the great generals. The Republic was no longer a government of the people. It was a hunting ground for ambitious men like Marcus Licinius Crassus and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, the very men who, unknowingly, would become Spartacus's executioners. The Thracian gladiators' uprising wasn't just a slave revolt. It was the clearest symptom that Rome's social structure was rotten, and that real power resided in the ability to control armies, or in Spartacus's case, to create one from scratch. Rome's arrogance lay in the fact that, even in this internal chaos, it felt invulnerable to any external threat, let alone an internal threat arising from the lowest levels of its society. This contempt was precisely what made it so vulnerable to the attack of a simple slave. The pillar upon which Rome sustained its absolute arrogance and its global dominance was, without a doubt, its military muscle, the Roman legion. In 73 BC, the legions were seen not just as an army, but as a force of nature, a perfectly oiled and unbeatable war machine. For the average Roman and for the Senate, the idea of losing a significant battle, let alone a war, was simply unthinkable, a foolish notion only imagined by barbarians. This perception of invincibility wasn't unfounded. The Romans had proven to be masters of adaptation, discipline, and above all, military engineering. It didn't matter if they fought against the fierce Gauls, the disciplined Hellenistic armies, or the Carthaginian horsemen. The legions always prevailed, and they did so thanks to two key factors: their organization and their tenacity. The organization of a legion was a marvel of bureaucratic and military efficiency. Each legionary was trained to be a cog within a lethal machine, from handling the gladius, that short, double-edged sword ideal for close combat, to launching the pilum, that heavy javelin designed to bend upon impact and render the enemy's shield useless. But their greatest advantage was their logistical capability. Legionaries didn't just fight. They marched for miles carrying all their equipment, dug ditches, built fortified camps, castra, in a single afternoon and constructed bridges and roads. They were engineers with sword. This warfighting capability fueled the Roman mentality of domination, which was as intrinsic to their culture as the worship of the gods or their love of public baths. The Romans firmly believed in their virtus, manly excellence, and their gloria, glory, in their almost divine right to rule over other peoples. For them, any conflict was a just war, because their ultimate goal was to bring Roman peace. The Pax Romana, which in practice simply meant total submission to Roman rule. Conquered peoples had to pay tribute, abide by Roman laws, and crucially, feed the most vital institution of their economy, slavery. Therefore, when a group of slaves, of gladiators, men considered little more than talking tools, dared to flee, Rome's immediate reaction was one of profound contempt. It wasn't perceived as a military threat, but as a police matter, a simple gang of bandits that needed to be eliminated quickly. The idea that these tools could adopt the discipline and tactics of the legion and use them against them was such a grave offense to Roman dignitas, dignity, honor, that no one in the Senate was prepared for the humiliation that was coming. What Spartacus was about to demonstrate to them was that, as impressive as the Roman military machine was, its greatest weakness was its own arrogance, the blind belief that its power was invulnerable. That arrogance is what allowed the spark of 70 men to quickly turn into a wildfire of thousands. To understand the true dimension of Spartacus's revolt, it's essential to delve into the institution that defined the Roman economy and society: slavery. We're not talking about a marginal or accessory form of slavery. We're talking about a structure that was the very backbone of the Republic. Roman law was brutally clear and can be summarized in a single word: res, or thing. For the Roman legal system, a slave was literally property, a movable object. The law classified them as instrumentum vocale, which translates to speaking tool, differentiating them from instrumentum semivocale, livestock, and instrumentum mutum, inanimate tools, like a plow. This classification isn't a simple academic detail, it's a definition of their existence. A slave lacked legal personhood, which was fundamental. They couldn't own property, couldn't legally marry, and therefore their children were automatically the property of the master. They couldn't testify in court unless under torture. Imagine the life of a slave. Their master had the power of life and death over them, although over time, with some philosophical influences, extreme mistreatment began to be frowned upon socially, but not legally sanctioned in an effective way. If a slave was killed by their master, this wasn't considered homicide, but simply damage to the owner's property, as if they had broken a vase. The concept of kidnapping a slave didn't exist. It was considered theft of property, and the penalty fell on the thief, not the victim. This dehumanization was essential for the system to function at the scale that it did. Roman society depended on a constant and massive influx of free labor. It's estimated that at the height of the Republic, between 20 and 30% of the total population of Italy, and in some regions like the South, even a much higher percentage, was composed of slaves. They were the engine of the latifundia, vast agricultural estates. They worked in workshops, served in homes, and most harshly of all, died in the mines. This denial of personhood, this reduction of a human being to the category of thing, is what makes the figure of Spartacus so powerful and so feared by the Roman elite. Spartacus didn't just free himself. He freed thousands of things and demonstrated that these speaking tools could think, could organize, and most terrifyingly for Rome, could fight for the concept that had been denied to them: personal freedom and human dignity. At its core, his rebellion was a struggle to be recognized as men and women, not as res. Rome's slavery machine required constant feeding, and its sources were as varied as they were brutal, but all converged on one point: the Republic's relentless expansion. The main and most massive source of slaves was undoubtedly large-scale prisoners of war. In a world where war wasn't just a territorial conflict but also a business, the conquest of new provinces meant the influx of thousands, and sometimes tens of thousands, of people into the slave market. Think of a victorious general. One of the greatest displays of his glory was the vast amount of loot he brought back to Rome. And the most valuable loot was human beings. When Julius Caesar conquered Gaul decades later, it's estimated that he reduced more than 1 million Gauls to slavery. Before that, the great campaigns in Hispania, Greece, and Asia each provided a constant flow of forced labor. These men and women, many of them educated, others warriors, were chained and forced to march to Italy to be sold. A successful general could finance his political career and that of his successors simply by selling prisoners. This massive influx was the reason why the price of a slave remained accessible and why the latifundia could operate on an industrial scale. However, not all slavery came from large-scale wars. There was also trade across borders, an international market of people. The Mediterranean was a hotbed of pirates, especially the Illyrians, whom we'll talk more about later in the story of Spartacus. These pirates kidnapped people from the coasts, sailors, and even Roman citizens on journeys, to sell them in ports like Delos, which was a gigantic hub for human trafficking, a market where thousands of souls changed hands in a single day. Rome ironically complained about the pirates that plagued it, but it depended on them to keep the market well supplied. Finally, although it was a less numerous source, there was enslavement for debt. Although Roman laws varied over time, and the enslavement of a Roman citizen for debt had become illegal, debt could affect the offspring of foreigners or those who fell into extreme poverty. Furthermore, and this is crucial, the children of a female slave were automatically born slaves of the master. This was the so-called verni, an internal source of slaves that, although not as massive as wars, ensured a constant renewal of the workforce without the need for importation. This lethal combination of wars of conquest, international trade, and internal reproduction guaranteed that the Roman social pyramid always had a wide base of dispossessed upon which the elite could build their palaces, finance their political campaigns, and most importantly, enjoy a life of leisure that was only possible thanks to the incessant and unremunerated labor of millions of slaves. For the vast majority of newly arrived slaves, life in Italy was a hell of constant labor and dehumanization that went far beyond being a simple speaking tool. There was a cruel hierarchy in this hell. A domestic slave who served a wealthy family in the city could expect a relatively better life, with better food and less physical exertion, although always subject to the whims of their masters. But that wasn't the fate of the thousands of prisoners of war. They ended up in the most brutal trenches of the Roman economy. The first infernal destination was the latifundia. These weren't small farms. They were gigantic agricultural plantations, especially vast in southern Italy and Sicily, dedicated to cultivating wheat, grapes, and olives. The latifundia were the clearest proof that the agrarian reforms had failed and that wealth had been concentrated in a few hands. These latifundia were largely worked by gangs of slaves, often chained together to prevent escapes and make any attempt at rebellion more difficult. The Roman poet Martial described these slaves as if they were cattle, and their supervisor, the villicus, was nothing more than an overseer who applied the whip with total impunity. The workday began before dawn and ended after sunset. The goal was maximum production with minimum expense. Slaves were given a basic ration of food, dressed in rags, and housed in dark and subterranean barracks known as ergastula. These ergastula functioned as prisons. They were veritable holes in the earth designed for slaves to live and sleep in, chained up at night, thus ensuring that they would be available for work the next day and that they couldn't escape. It's important to emphasize the irony. Many of these men had been warriors or free farmers in their countries, and now they were treated worse than animals by a civilization that prided itself on its legal and cultural superiority. This system of ergastula in the vast estates of southern Italy is precisely the raw material, the social powder keg that quickly fueled Spartacus's rebellion. But if the latifundia were harsh, the worst possible fate was the mines. In the mines, brutality wasn't a measure of discipline, but a certainty of death. Mining slaves were considered entirely expendable. They worked in narrow, dark, and dangerous tunnels, digging and extracting metals like gold, silver, or lead. The conditions were atrocious. Suffocating dust, humidity, lack of ventilation, and the constant threat of collapses. Masters didn't invest in the safety of these workers because it was cheaper to replace a dead slave than to improve the conditions. This made their life expectancy incredibly short, often no more than a few years of forced labor until the body gave out. Life in the mines was a slow death sentence, a place where physical abuse was the norm and not the exception, the rawest expression of the Roman view of the slave as a simple residential that breaks. This backdrop of mass suffering is what gives context to Spartacus's uprising. It wasn't a struggle for better rations or better conditions. It was an explosion of despair and the only conceivable way to escape a life that, for most, only promised the whip, the chain, and a premature death in the darkness of a mine or under the scorching sun of a latifundium. If we want to understand why Spartacus's uprising terrified Rome so much, we must first look to the past, specifically to the island of Sicily, which by the 2nd century BC had already been the scene of two social and military catastrophes that demonstrated the inherent fragility of the slave system. These were the so-called Servile Wars. The First Servile War, which erupted between 135 and 132 BC, was a trial by fire that Rome initially ignored with its usual arrogance. The island of Sicily was then Rome's main granary, and its vast fields of wheat and pastureland were dominated by the aforementioned latifundia, worked by multitudes of slaves in appalling conditions, identical or even worse than those experienced in southern Italy. Abuses were rampant, and despair was the only legal tender. The rebellion began under the leadership of a man named Eunice. Eunice was a Syrian slave who wasn't a warrior or a gladiator, but presented himself as a prophet and magician. This is a fascinating detail. Instead of wielding a sword, Eunice used religion and charisma, claiming that the gods had tasked him with leading the slaves to freedom. He proclaimed himself king, assuming the name Antiochus, and founded a capital, Enna. His message was so powerful that the rebellion spread like wildfire. The slaves, disorganized but numerous and motivated by the divine promise of freedom, achieved a series of initial victories that were absolutely humiliating for Rome. The impact on the Roman mind was twofold. First and most importantly, it demonstrated that an army of slaves, however poorly armed, could defeat Roman consular forces. Rome had to send entire legions to suppress the uprising, taking 3 years to quell it. The second impact was the terror that settled in the hearts of the landowning elite. The revolt of Eunice and his followers was a veritable bloodbath. The slaves, upon being freed, took revenge on their masters with a cruelty that the Romans would not easily forget. And the specter of a mass massacre of citizens at the hands of their own servants became a recurring nightmare for the Republic. Although the rebellion was crushed and Eunice captured and executed, the lesson was largely lost. Rome attributed the initial success of the rebels to its own negligence and not to the force of the slaves' desperation. No substantial reforms were made to the latifundia system, and the final response, brutal repression, was the only thing the ruling class retained, thus setting a dangerous precedent that the only way to maintain social peace was through absolute terror. Rome's inability to learn from this episode was what paved the way for a second Servile War and, inevitably, for the eruption of Spartacus. When Rome had barely recovered from the unrest of the First Servile War, history, as if it were a repetitive tragedy, struck again in the same place and for the same reasons. Only about 3 decades after the defeat of Eunice, Sicily once again became the epicenter of rebellion between 104 and 100 BC, confirming that the threat of slaves wasn't an isolated event, but a chronic and recurring disease of the Roman system. The spark of this Second Servile War was somewhat different, although the engine or desperation was the same. On this occasion, the revolt was triggered by a decree from the Senate that sought to free certain slaves who were citizens of states allied to Rome and who had been illegally sold. This decree, intended to appease the Italic allies, was handled with clumsiness and corruption in Sicily. The local governors, bribed by the owners of the latifundia, refused to release most of the slaves, which fueled frustration and outrage among those who had seen the promise of freedom so close. Led by 2 key figures, Salvius, who proclaimed himself King Tryphon in the west, and Athenian in the east, the slaves rose up again. Unlike Eunice's revolt, this time the leaders were more military and less prophetic. Athenian was a slave who had been an organizer of bandits and had remarkable military experience. The slaves organized themselves with more discipline than on the first occasion, and the combined forces of Salvius and Athenian managed to resist for 4 full years against the armies sent from the Italian peninsula. The impact of this second war on the Roman mind was definitive. They could no longer dismiss slave revolts as isolated incidents caused by the mismanagement of a single governor. A pattern had been established. Large-scale slavery, especially that used in the inhuman conditions of the southern latifundia, was a social powder keg that sooner or later would explode again. For the Romans, the Second Servile War consolidated the terror and the need for exemplary repression. Each defeat of a Roman legion by an army of servants undermined the image of Roman military invincibility, not against a well-trained foreign army, but against their own human property. Although eventually the consul Gaius Marius and later Manius Aquilius managed to crush the rebellion and execute its leaders, the lesson that it left in Rome wasn't one of reform, but of terror and prevention. This constant fear, this social trauma, is fundamental to understanding. Here's the English translation, rewritten in a refined and slightly expanded style. The hysterical and brutal reaction that Rome would have 3 decades later was triggered when the number of rebels swelled from a few tens of thousands on a remote island to over 100,000. This massive force operated right in the Italian peninsula's heart, led by the most skilled of them all, Spartacus. The Servile Wars in Sicily were, in essence, a dress rehearsal for the main performance about to unfold. This brings us to the microcosm that would forge our hero, the world of the Gladiator. It's a stark transition from the broad scope of the Servile Wars to the confined arena of an amphitheater, but it's here, in the heart of spectacle and death, that Spartacus forged his legend. To the average Roman, gladiators weren't merely slaves, they were lethal celebrities embodying the Roman virtus, though their initial purpose was far more somber and ceremonial. To understand their origins, we must journey back in time to a tradition initially Etruscan, deeply intertwined with funerary rites. The first attested gladiatorial combats in Rome, around 264 BCE, were essentially human sacrifices by proxy. It was believed that the blood of a man spilled in combat at a noble's funeral would appease the manes, or spirits of the dead. Essentially, the fight was an offering to honor the deceased. Over time, this somber funerary ritual was co-opted by politics and, as with everything in Rome, transformed into a massive spectacle. The Roman nobility, ever hungry for fame and power, realized that financing and organizing spectacular gladiatorial games, or munera, was the quickest and most effective way to win the favor of the people, secure votes, and build a reputation for generosity. The games migrated from funerals to public squares and eventually to vast amphitheaters. Stripped of their religious origins, the game's purpose evolved into a blend of brutal entertainment and socio-political indoctrination. On one level, it was pure entertainment for the masses, a bloody substitute for theater or music, offering the visceral thrill of life and death in real time. Gladiators, with their exotic armor and dramatic fighting styles, were the rock stars of their era. But on a deeper level, the games were a morality play of Roman values in action. They theatrically represented virtus, the courage, strength, and indifference to death that every Roman citizen was expected to emulate. For the spectator in the stands, watching a man fall with dignity, accepting defeat and death without pleading, was the ultimate expression of the Roman spirit. And for the enslaved and subjugated peoples forced to fight, the arena was a constant and inescapable reminder of Roman supremacy. If a gladiator died, it proved his inferiority to the Roman warrior who vanquished him, or, at best, that he died with the honor Rome demanded. This system, where human life became a mere spectacle for public enjoyment, was the environment Spartacus was forced to navigate, and it ultimately provided him with the military training necessary to turn against his masters. The gladiator school in Capua, where the spark of rebellion would ignite, was a place where men were trained to die with style. Achieving the perfect spectacle of death required a training infrastructure as disciplined as the legions themselves. This is where the ludus comes into play. The ludus was essentially a gladiator school, a high-security prison disguised as a gymnasium. The most famous of these, at least for our story, was that of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua, a city south of Rome renowned as a training center for arena elite. The ludus was no pleasant place. It was a fortress surrounded by high walls. Inside, slaves, prisoners of war, and sometimes freemen who had sold themselves for money lived under iron discipline, far stricter than that of a regular Roman barrack. Life was governed by the whip, a rigorous diet, and constant exercise. The goal was not only to turn them into killing machines but also into athletic figures capable of enduring in the arena and providing a good show, thus elevating their market value. If you're listening to this point in the video, I hope you've already subscribed to the channel. I am the Knight Historian, and my desire is to have a huge community of people who love the knights and the knowledge, thousands of people from all over the world connected by that intrinsic desire to know more in order to know more about oneself and have a better life. I always say it and emphasize it. Knowing history is fundamental to not repeat the mistakes of the past. And that is why I want you to take a few seconds to subscribe and share this video with your knowledge-loving friend. Not to mention, if your generous spirit arises the motivation to give a super thanks to this humble servant. In any case, the gratitude on my part is already infinite for simply sharing this moment. Now yes, let's continue with the story. The central figure in this school was the lanista. This was the owner of the ludus and, by extension, the owner of his gladiators' lives. The lanista was an entrepreneur of death, investing vast sums in buying, training, and equipping his fighters, then renting them out to magistrates or wealthy men who wanted to put on their own munera, or games. Though fabulously wealthy, lanisti were socially despised by the Roman elite. They were considered merchants of blood, immersed in a dirty business. Nevertheless, within the world of gladiators, the lanista's word was law, dictating life and death. And Lentulus Batiatus was among the greatest and least scrupulous of them all. Spartacus and his comrades' daily routine consisted of grueling exercises, practice with wooden weapons, and special diets. Interestingly, gladiators ate a lot of barley and legumes, which gave them a layer of fat under the skin. While this didn't make them appear muscular, it helped protect their veins and internal organs from superficial cuts, allowing them to withstand injuries more easily in the arena and prolong the drama. The most terrifying aspect of life in the ludus was the prospect of death. They were trained to die. They were taught that the only honor lay in a quick and dignified death, showing no fear. Every training session, every meal, every moment of rest was overshadowed by the certainty that their careers would end in the arena before thousands of eyes waiting to see them bleed to death. This was the ultimate contradiction. They were trained to be the fiercest warriors but denied the right to use that strength for themselves. The ludus was a cage that transformed men into combat beasts. This forced dehumanization, this preparation for an inevitable and humiliating end, was the pressure cooker that made the escape from Capua a desperate necessity to reclaim their humanity and their future. The world of the arena was incredibly specialized, a carnival of weapons, armor, and exotic names. Gladiators didn't simply fight with swords. They fought according to strict rules and were categorized by their weaponry, which often referenced foreign peoples conquered by Rome, reinforcing the narrative of Roman supremacy. Historical sources about Spartacus are somewhat ambiguous, but most, including Plutarch and Florus, agree that he was either a Thracian or fought in the Thracian style. The Thracian style was one of the most well-known and appealing to the public. The Thracian gladiator carried a small rectangular or square shield called a parmula and a short, deadly curved sword known as a sicca. This curved sword was perfect for stabbing or cutting over the opponent's shield. The Thracian wore leg armor, greaves, and an arm protector, but his head was covered by a visored helmet, often topped with an aggressive-looking crest or feathers. His most common and natural opponent was the murmillo. The murmillo was another type of heavily armed and protected gladiator. His name came from the fish-shaped crest on top of his helmet. He was equipped with a large, oblong shield, the scutum, the same one used by legionaries, and a short, straight sword, the gladius. The fight between the quick, curved Thracian and the heavy, defensive murmillo was an arena classic, representing the clash of foreign combat styles with the Roman style. Other popular types included the retiarius, the netman, a gladiator who wore only a shoulder protector and fought with a net, a trident, and a dagger, and his usual opponent, the secutor or pursuer, who was heavily armed to prevent the net from ensnaring him. Gladiator training focused entirely on specialization. A Thracian like Spartacus spent his days perfecting the use of the sicca, learning to move agilely despite his heavy armor, and using his small shield to deflect rather than completely block attack. He was trained in the tactic of striking and quickly retreating. This specialization in individual combat, coupled with the rigor of the ludus discipline, was ironically the key factor in his later military success. Spartacus was a warrior who had already faced death dozens of times. He not only knew how to fight but also how to manage fear and use terrain and deception to his advantage. Lentulus Batiatus wasn't just training gladiators for the arena. He was unwittingly forging the perfect weapon against the power of Rome. The man who rose against Rome has become a legendary figure over the centuries, an archetype of the freedom fighter. But if we scratch beneath the veneer of Hollywood myth, we find a fascinating historical enigma. Who was Spartacus, the man behind the legend? The first difficulty in discussing Spartacus is the scarcity of primary sources. The historians who wrote about him, Plutarch, Appian, and Florus, did so decades after his death and from the perspective of the victors, the Romans, who had little interest in glorifying a rebellious slave. Their accounts, therefore, are often biased, but they offer the only clues we have about his past. All agree on his origin, Thracian. Thrace was a vast and mountainous region encompassing parts of modern-day Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. To the Romans, Thrace was synonymous with warlike ferocity. Thracians were known to be excellent fighters and were often employed by Rome as auxiliary troops or, ironically, sold as gladiators to capitalize on their innate bravery in the arena. This is where the uncertainty begins. Plutarch, the most detailed of the Greek biographers, provides the most romantic version. He claims that Spartacus was a man of the Thracian tribe of the Medi who had served as an auxiliary soldier in the Roman army. This is crucial because if he was an auxiliary, it would mean that he not only knew the Latin language but was also familiar with the tactics, discipline, and logistics of the Roman legion. If this version is true, his fall into slavery must have been due to some crime or desertion, a punishment that led him directly to the ludus in Capua, a less common path than simply being a prisoner of war. Appian, another historian, offers a more direct, though briefer, version, stating that Spartacus was a Thracian prisoner of war. This version is the most common for gladiator slaves, captured in battle and sold. If this version is correct, Spartacus would have arrived in Capua as a talented warrior but without formal Roman military training, making his later tactical skill even more surprising and purely intuitive. Florus, for his part, adds a more novelistic touch, describing him as a Thracian soldier who had been enslaved, and who rose from a simple soldier to a bandit, and then, due to his strength, to a gladiator. This ambiguity about whether he was a soldier who deserted or a captured bandit only reinforces the idea that his past was shrouded in mystery, a mystery he likely cultivated himself to enhance his aura as a leader. What remains clear is that whether a simple prisoner or an auxiliary, degradation to a gladiator was the ultimate humiliation. Going from being a respected warrior to a tool trained to die in a spectacle must have shaped his visceral hatred of Roman arrogance. This Thracian origin not only gave him the physical strength he needed but also a cultural connection to his Gallic and Germanic comrades in the ludus, as Thracians often shared the status of untamable barbarians in the eyes of Rome. Spartacus's true power lay not in his uncertain origins but in his character and his astounding leadership ability. Here, the Roman historians, even wanting to minimize him, cannot avoid showing a deep, begrudging admiration for the slave who humiliated them. Plutarch describes him best, distinguishing him from other gladiators. He was not merely the strongest or most bloodthirsty but the most intelligent and civilized. Plutarch writes, "He had not only great courage and strength but also an intellect superior to his fate and more Hellenic than Thracian." The term more Hellenic doesn't refer to his being Greek, but to his possessing the virtues that the Romans associated with high Greek culture: prudence, strategic foresight, and a nobility of spirit. Spartacus didn't just lead in combat. He was a strategist who thought long-term. This distinction was key. Most leaders of previous slave revolts, such as Eunice and Salvius, had fallen into the temptation of royalty and short-term looting. Spartacus, however, demonstrated a sense of justice and discipline that surpassed that of many Roman generals of the time: long-term vision. His primary goal, and the one that would later separate him from his second-in-command, Crixus, wasn't to loot Italy or establish a slave kingdom, but to cross the Alps and lead his men back to their homelands, back to freedom. This vision, this sense of purpose beyond immediate revenge, was what held together a rabble of slaves, shepherds, and bandits, transforming them into a cohesive army. Equitable distribution. Plutarch recounts a crucial detail that underscores his sense of justice. Spartacus decreed that all captured loot should be distributed equally and that no one could hoard gold or silver for themselves. By imposing economic equality in his army, he eliminated greed and internal disputes, which had historically disintegrated slave armies, cementing deep loyalty. Moral authority. A particularly revealing passage, though of dubious historical accuracy, speaks of Spartacus's wife. It is said that she was a prophetess from his own tribe. When Spartacus was captured and about to be sold, she saw a snake coiled around his sleeping face, a sign that great power and a terrifying end awaited him. This touch of mysticism and the presence of his wife underscore that Spartacus wasn't just a soldier but a figure with moral and almost religious authority among his own people, a man who seemed destined for greatness and tragedy. In short, Spartacus distinguished himself from other slaves and gladiators by his ability to transcend the brutality of his condition. He took the lethal discipline of the ludus and put it at the service of a noble cause, a dream of freedom for all his people. He didn't seek power for power's sake. He sought freedom, and in the process, he became the only man who could inspire such profound terror in the heart of the invincible republic, proving that even the most oppressed speaking tool could possess the soul of a great general. The summer of 73 BCE was scorching in Capua, but within the thick walls of the ludus of Lentulus Batiatus, the atmosphere was even more stifling. The discipline was cruel, the food scarce, and the only certainty was combat to the death in the arena. However, in the darkness of the barracks, Spartacus was not only forging his body but also weaving the web of a desperate conspiracy. The plan was ambitious, a massive, silent, and coordinated escape. Spartacus, along with two of his fiercest lieutenants, the Gaul Crixus and the German Enemaus, had managed to convince about 200 of the school's most robust and desperate gladiators to join the cause. The strategy hinged on surprise, but in an environment where distrust and denunciation were control tools as effective as the whip, the secret didn't last. Historical sources, including Plutarch, agree that the plot was betrayed. Someone, probably a domestic slave or a pusillanimous gladiator seeking the favor of the lanista, revealed the details to Lentulus Batiatus. This discovery forced Spartacus and his comrades to act immediately, without the time needed for meticulous planning. Their escape was not the surgical act of strategy they had planned but a chaotic and violent burst of pure survival. Instead of a discreet escape of 200 men, they became a much smaller group of about 74 desperate individuals who had to fight to the death for every inch of ground. The betrayal robbed them of surprise but injected them with fury. Once the plot was discovered, the 74 men knew that their fate was crucifixion or immediate combat. The crucial problem was that they were locked up and unarmed. Their first and most desperate battle was to acquire something with which to defend themselves. The account of this initial struggle is one of the most vivid and frankly comical, if it weren't so tragic, passages in the history of the rebellion. The men didn't head to an armory but to the kitchens of the ludus. Imagine the scene. Instead of swords and spears, these gladiators, Rome's most highly trained killing machines, armed themselves with whatever they could find. Plutarch recounts that they seized kitchen knives, skewers, carving forks, and the heavy bars used for roasting meat. With these improvised and utterly ridiculous tools for combat, they faced the guards of the ludus. The success of the fight was due to their training and the shock generated by their brutality. They managed to subdue the guards and finally found their first and true spoils of war, a cart that was meant to carry the gladiators' equipment to the games. In that cart they found armor and, most importantly, gladiator weapons abandoned by other fighters. From being a mob of armed cooks, they transformed into what they had been trained to be: lethal warriors. The cart was their first ark, and the gladiator weapons their first promise of victory. With chaos unleashed in Capua, the 74 fugitives forced their way through the gate and escaped into the open countryside. The flight was led by the triumvirate that would cement the first triumphs of the revolt: Spartacus, the Thracian, the strategic mind, the leader with vision; Crixus, the Gaul, the fierce and audacious warrior, representing the Gallic and Germanic majority of the gladiators; and Enemaus, the German, another tribal leader, known for his brute strength and initial loyalty to the cause. Their immediate destination wasn't disorganized flight, but a place that offered them refuge and immediate defensive potential. The choice couldn't be more astute. Instead of heading north, where they would encounter more prepared Roman garrisons, they headed towards the place that would guarantee them natural defense, access to food, and the promise of attracting more desperate individuals: the imposing and, at that time, dormant Mount Vesuvius. This group of 74 men, with their stolen weapons and their dreams of freedom, was barely an annoyance to Rome, a mere security problem. But what the Romans didn't know was that in escaping, these men had taken the discipline of the ludus and turned it into the seed of an army that would soon be nourished by all the oppressed of Italy. The path from Capua to Vesuvius wasn't just a flight. It was the first step in a slave civil war that would force Rome to expend more blood and treasure than almost any other war of conquest of the time. Leaving behind the massacre in Capua and the humiliation of the guards of the ludus, the 74 fugitives faced their first major strategic decision. They couldn't simply wander. They needed a refuge, a place to consolidate, rearm, and await the inevitable Roman response. Spartacus, already demonstrating why Plutarch considered him a man with a superior intellect, made the brilliant decision to head for Mount Vesuvius, and this choice would seal the fate of the revolt's first months. Vesuvius, which at that time was inactive, remember that its famous, destructive eruption that buried Pompeii would occur more than 150 years later, in 79 AD, wasn't seen by the Romans as a volcanic threat but simply as a prominent mountain. But for Spartacus and his men, it was the perfect natural fortress. The strategic choice of Vesuvius was based on two pillars: refuge and potential spoils. The mountain offered an ideal geography for defense. Its slopes, densely wooded and rocky, were extremely difficult to scale or assault by a regular army using the marching tactics and formations of the Roman legions. The summit and the higher areas were almost completely inaccessible by normal routes, allowing the rebels to fortify themselves in a place where Rome's disciplined square formations would become useless. Moreover, the dense vegetation offered cover not only to conceal their actual numbers from Roman scouts but also to hide their raid. But Vesuvius wasn't just a fortress, it was a pantry. Its foothills were surrounded by vineyards and prosperous farms, as the Campania region was Rome's great garden. This location guaranteed them access to fresh food, water, and the supplies needed to survive a siege. Rome, with its traditionally arrogant mentality, would never think that a group of slaves would dare to camp so close to important cities like Pompeii or Capua itself. The proximity to these population centers was a calculated risk by Spartacus, as it served as a magnet to attract more desperate slaves from the nearby latifundia, agricultural estates, who, upon learning of the existence of an army of free men, would flock to join the cause. Vesuvius wasn't just a hiding place. It was a recruitment center that would grow their strength exponentially. Once on Vesuvius, Spartacus immediately demonstrated why Plutarch considered him a man with a superior intellect. His first task was to transform a heterogeneous group of furious but undisciplined gladiators into a functional military force. The initial organization was pragmatic and based on the tribal reality of the fugitive. A clear command hierarchy was established, a basic principle. Spartacus had clearly learned a thing or two from the Romans, whether through serving as an auxiliary or simply observing them. He solidified his position as the supreme military leader, the strategos of the revolt. This wasn't solely due to his skill with a sword or his charisma, but also because of his clear vision for the war, understanding the need for discipline and a long-term strategy. Under him, Crixus and Oenomaus were reconfirmed as commanders of their respective factions. Crixus, the Gaul, took leadership of the vast majority of Celtic and Gallic gladiators, who were numerous in Batiatus's ludus. Oenomaus, the German, commanded the Germanic faction. This division was necessary to maintain tribal cohesion, allowing each group to operate with their own combat customs and dialects. This tripartite leadership structure proved incredibly effective. All three men, being gladiators, understood combat, risk, and courage, but each brought a distinct quality to the table. Spartacus was the mind, Crixus the impulsive bravery, and Oenomaus the unyielding strength. The most urgent and crucial task was rearmament. Kitchen knives and roasting spits were useful, but not nearly enough to face a legion. Therefore, the initial raids from Mount Vesuvius had a single objective: stealing weapons and acquiring tools. The rebels assaulted isolated farms and villages, not only for food but also for iron, wood, and, above all, agricultural tools. In a display of effective primitive engineering, Spartacus put his men to work manufacturing their own weapons, converting plow blades and farm implements into makeshift spears and swords. This initial, militarily disciplined, and strategically positioned organization transformed a group of fugitives into a latent threat. Vesuvius became a beacon of freedom, and every slave who managed to escape their latifundium or mine and scale its slopes ceased to be mere property and became a soldier in Spartacus's nascent army. It confirmed that the greatest threat to Rome was about to spring forth from within its own territory. Once Spartacus and his men settled on Vesuvius, news of raids, thefts, and the killing of some overseers began to reach the bustling and complacent Roman Forum. The initial reaction of the Senate to the news of the Gladiator revolt is perhaps the greatest testament to their blindness and unbearable arrogance, an error that would cost thousands of Roman lives. For the Roman elite, the revolt wasn't a war but a mere nuisance, a bandit raid, or a matter for thieves, as they contemptuously labeled it. Remember, the Republic was in a moment of intense rearmament and military activity on other frontiers. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus was occupied in Hispania fighting against Quintus Sertorius, and Lucius Licinius Lucullus was in Pontus in Asia Minor facing the formidable King Mithridates. To the Senate, these were the important conflicts, the wars that defined empires. A few escaped slaves and rebellious gladiators were merely a matter of internal security that didn't merit the distraction of a true consular legion or the attention of a general with genuine imperium. Let's be frank. The idea that a Thracian slave could be a military strategist was so offensive to Roman dignitas that they didn't even consider it. The reaction was, in essence, to send a glorified foreman to punish the slaves. This initial contempt, this deadly underestimation of the enemy, was Spartacus's first great strategic triumph, without even having drawn his sword against a Roman army. The responsibility for quelling this minor revolt fell to the praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber. The choice of Glaber already speaks to the level of disinterest in the Senate. Glaber was not an experienced general but a magistrate with political ambitions seeking an easy and quick victory to add to his curriculum. Instead of sending him complete and veteran legions, which were all occupied abroad, the Senate gave him an improvised militia of 3,000 recruits. Think about these men. They were not the hardened veterans of Hispania or Asia, but ordinary citizens, possibly young men who had avoided mandatory military service until that moment and who lacked real combat experience. They were armed and dressed as legionaries, but in terms of discipline and morale, they were leagues away from a professional legion. Glaber and his militia marched with overconfidence towards Vesuvius, convinced that merely showing their weapons would be enough to make the bandits surrender. His strategy was as lazy as his mentality. Instead of directly assaulting the mountain, which would have been difficult, or surrounding it for a classic siege, which would have required more troops, Glaber simply camped on the only known route of descent. He positioned himself at a strategic point at the foot of the volcano, blocking the path the rebels would necessarily have to take to escape. Glaber's siege strategy was passive, simply waiting for hunger and thirst to force the slaves to come down and surrender. He was so sure of his success that he didn't even bother to properly fortify his camp or establish guards on the rest of the perimeter, considering the opposite side of the mountain inaccessible. This was his fatal error. Spartacus and his lieutenants observed from the summit with a mixture of fury and intelligence. They understood that Glaber's passive siege was designed to starve them without the risk of a frontal combat, and they knew they had to escape before supplies ran low. The solution devised by Spartacus is one of the boldest and most brilliant maneuvers in ancient military history, a true coup d'etat that would cement his reputation among his followers. The side of Vesuvius that Glaber had ignored was, in fact, a rocky and steep wall covered by dense wild vegetation, including numerous vines, wild grape plants, that grew vigorously down the slopes. The plan was suicidal in its conception but brilliantly executed. Spartacus ordered his men to cut and braid the vines to create long and resistant ropes. Then, in the total darkness of the night, while the Roman army slept confidently, some 70-odd men of Spartacus didn't descend the blocked path but rappelled down the rocky precipice that Glaber considered impassable. The image is incredibly powerful. Gladiators, men who had been trained for death, silently descending an abyss, trusting their lives to ropes woven with the vines of the land they were fighting to leave. The maneuver was a total success. Once they reached the foot of the cliff, they circled the base of the mountain and positioned themselves behind the Roman camp. The attack at dawn was a massacre. The Romans, taken completely by surprise and without proper fortifications, were attacked from the rear by these men who were supposed to be dying of thirst on the summit. Glaber and his 3,000 recruits were defeated, scattered, and humiliated. Glaber managed to flee, but his army was annihilated or dispersed. Most importantly, the rebels captured a huge booty of Roman weapons, armor, and military supplies. This victory not only boosted the morale of the slaves. The humiliation of Glaber was a political earthquake in Rome. The joke about bandits was over. The revolt was no longer a police matter but a war. And Vesuvius, the initial nest of the rebellion, had become the site of Spartacus's first great triumph, confirming that the audacity and strategy of a slave could overcome the arrogance of a Roman praetor. The humiliation of Gaius Claudius Glaber on Vesuvius was not just a military victory. It was the trigger for a social explosion that Spartacus had anticipated. The news spread like wildfire through the latifundia and plantations of southern Italy, and what had been a group of 74 fugitives became a human tide. The consequences of that first victory were the basis for the formation of the largest slave army that ever challenged Rome. Campania, the region where the escape occurred, was one of the richest and most densely populated areas of slaves in Italy. The Roman villi, those large properties dedicated to the production of luxury agricultural products, were filled with thousands of rural slaves who lived under the oppression of the villici, or overseers. These men and women, tired of the chains, the knights in the ergastulum, and the whip, were just waiting for a sign. Spartacus's victory gave them more than a sign. It gave them tangible proof that the Roman masters could be defeated. It was not a prophetic promise, as in the First Servile War in Sicily. It was the reality that a few gladiators had defeated a Roman militia. More importantly, they had seized their weapons. People were not only fed up with slavery but realized that if they didn't join now, Roman revenge would be terrible and would reach them sooner or later. The call to action was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of rural slaves simply abandoned their work, broke their chains, and fled towards Vesuvius, marching barefoot to join the army of the free. Sources say that Spartacus's army grew to more than 10,000 men in a matter of weeks. This massive influx was a game-changer. The revolt had transcended from a gladiator problem to a labor and national security crisis. Spartacus found himself overnight with an army that, although undisciplined and poorly armed, was immense and motivated by limitless fury and desperation. The logistics of feeding, training, and equipping this new mass of men became his immediate challenge. Rome, still not understanding the magnitude of its problem, sent a second expedition. Again underestimating Spartacus's capacity for mobile warfare, the task of quelling the rebellion fell to the praetor Publius Varinius. Varinius, feeling the pressure from Glaber's humiliation, decided to take more serious measures, gathering a larger force, although still composed largely of troops of dubious quality. Varinius tried to corner the rebels in southern Italy. Spartacus, however, was no longer waiting on the top of a volcano. His new tactic was mobility and deception. Aware that the indiscipline of his army was still a risk in a frontal battle against the legions, Spartacus moved through the countryside, raiding and retreating, wearing down the Roman forces. The key confrontation occurred in a series of skirmishes and finally in an encounter where Spartacus once again used deception with mastery. Plutarch narrates that one night, to simulate that his camp was still occupied while he and his main forces retreated, Spartacus had the bodies of dead prisoners tied to stakes and covered them with skins and branches so that from a distance, Roman sentinels would believe they saw men standing guard. When Varinius finally attacked the empty camp, Spartacus either attacked him from the rear or simply evaded him, managing to maintain his freedom of movement. The result of the confrontations was another double humiliation for Rome. Not only was Varinius's lieutenant defeated, but in the confusion, the rebels managed to seize the fasces, the bundle of rods symbolizing the power of a Roman magistrate, and even Varinius's horse. The moral blow was devastating. Spartacus seized a significant amount of Roman weaponry and supplies, the material he desperately needed to equip the thousands of new recruits. The victory over Varinius confirmed to Rome that they were not dealing with bandits but a talented general who had defeated 2 successive praetors. What is more remarkable than the military victories was Spartacus's effort to create a code of ethics for his army, distinguishing it from a mere horde of looters. This was not just out of idealism, but out of pure military necessity. An army that loots without control ends up self-destructing. Plutarch offers us a glimpse of this effort for discipline. One of Spartacus's first measures was the prohibition of gold and silver. He ordered that the loot captured in the raids be collected and then distributed equally among all the men. The idea behind this was twofold. First, to ensure that personal greed did not divide his ranks, something that had been a recurring problem in previous revolts. Second, gold and silver were heavy, and if their goal was to flee Italy, light equipment and mobility would be key. By forcing his men to get rid of treasure in favor of tools and weapons, Spartacus reminded them that their true reward was not wealth, but the freedom that lay beyond the Alps. In addition, Spartacus strove to discipline the newcomers. The rural slaves did not have the combat training of the gladiators. Using the structure of his corps of Thracian, Gallic, and Germanic gladiators, Spartacus began to train his new recruits in the use of captured Roman weapons, instructing them in basic formations and guerrilla tactics. This combination of discipline, fairness in the distribution of loot, and a common and noble goal transformed a mass of oppressed people into a cohesive and motivated army. Spartacus's camp was not just a refuge but a temporary society of men who had found their humanity by rejecting the rules of Roman society. The revolt of Spartacus had transformed in just a few months from an escape to a militarized migration for freedom, making it clear that its real strength lay not in its swords, but in the powerful ideal of an army of men who had proclaimed themselves free. As the autumn fogs grew thick and the cold began to bite in the countryside, Spartacus made a crucial decision that would mark the peak of his military power. Instead of languishing in Vesuvius, he decided to set his army in motion, a constantly growing body that now moved like an unstoppable force, ready to exploit the panic and power vacuum left by the defeats of Glaber and Varinius. The winter of 73 to 72 BC was the period of the most radical transformation for the rebels. Spartacus's army, which already numbered tens of thousands of men, could not afford to hibernate passively. He had to prepare for the inevitable counterattack from Rome, which this time would not send just militias. Spartacus imposed a Roman legionary discipline, a brutal irony. He used his gladiators and any slave who had prior military experience to act as instructors. The camp became a gigantic war school. The rural slaves learned to march in formation, to use the captured shields, and above all, to handle the gladius and the pilum, those weapons that had been designed to oppress them. Cohesion, quick obedience to orders, and the ability to build temporary field fortifications were emphasized, imitating Roman engineering skills. But the greatest achievement was the massive rearmament. The rebels could not rely solely on loot. They used slave blacksmiths, founders, and artisans who were now free to set up weapons manufacturing workshops. With the iron and bronze extracted from the raids and from agricultural tools, these improvised workshops manufactured spears, swords, and shields in large quantities. This meant that for the first time, an army of slaves not only fought with the fury of the oppressed but did so with the material capacity of a modern army. It was a force that, although lacking the prolonged combat experience of veteran legions, made up for that deficiency with numbers, learned discipline, and a vital cause. Once reinforced and trained, Spartacus's army marched towards southern Italy. This campaign had a dual purpose: to feed the troops and recruit more effective. Southern Italy, and in particular the provinces of Apulia and Lucania, was the heart of the latifundia and therefore the home of the largest concentration of rural slaves. The rebel army moved systematically through these regions, breaking the Roman order with each step. They raided the villi, freed the slaves from the ergastula and the mines who joined the cause with indescribable fury, and appropriated the harvests and livestock. Looting was not an end in itself, but a logistical strategy. Spartacus did not allow the personal accumulation of wealth, but did allow the use of captured food and materials for collective sustenance. The freed slaves immediately became warriors, increasing the combat strength of the army and reducing the economic capacity of Rome in its own territory. For the Roman landowners, it was total chaos. Seeing their talking tools rise up with weapons in hand led by a gladiator was a materialized nightmare. Spartacus's campaign in the south, far from Rome, allowed him to grow and consolidate without the direct pressure of a consular army, while the Senate wavered between disbelief and hysteria. The key to success in this initial and expansive campaign was Spartacus's tactical superiority, which exploited the fundamental weakness of the Roman army at the time: its rigidity. The Roman legions were unmatched in a pitched battle in open terrain, where they could deploy their disciplined formations and their engineering capabilities. But Spartacus understood that his strength lay in being the anti-Roman army. He embraced mobility. Instead of offering a frontal battle, where Roman experience would always prevail, Spartacus used mobile and guerrilla warfare, harassment. His riders, recruited from among the slave shepherds, harassed Roman supply lines and ambushed isolated detachments. He used the local knowledge of his recruits and the mountainous terrain of the south to mount surprise ambushes against marching Roman columns, attacking and retreating quickly before the Romans could form their battle lines. Disappear. If the consular forces approached with the intention of forcing a battle, Spartacus simply disappeared. An army composed of tens of thousands of people that did not depend on large logistical lines or fixed camps could move much faster than the heavy legions. This tactic not only avoided defeats but deeply demoralized the Roman forces sent against him. Their generals could not catch him, could not force him to fight where they wanted. And every time they thought they had cornered him, Spartacus was already in another province sacking a new villa. The Great Southern Campaign was, in essence, a masterful lesson in how the speed and intelligence of a general can prevail against the brute force and arrogance of an empire that refused to change its methods of war to face a slave. By 72 BC, panic had completely replaced mockery in Rome. The revolt, which had begun as a kitchen anecdote, had transformed into a national calamity, and the Roman elite realized, with a chill down their spines, that they had a full-scale war in the heart of Italy. The Senate was concerned. This was war, not policing. The repeated defeats of the praetors Glaber and Verinius, and the fact that Spartacus already dominated southern Italy at will meant that the Senate could no longer divert troops from serious wars abroad. It was a military and moral emergency. The Republic was being humiliated by its own slaves, and the image of Rome as the dominant force in the Mediterranean was at stake. In addition, the proximity of Spartacus's army to Rome, now estimated at over 90,000 people, unleashed collective hysteria. Wealthy citizens feared for their properties and for their lives. Finally, the Senate did what it had to do. It placed the repression of the servile revolt in the hands of the two most important magistrates of the Republic. The consuls of the year were Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus. The sending of two complete consular armies, each under the command of one of the two consuls of the Republic, was the ultimate demonstration that Spartacus's revolt was considered a full-fledged war, a bellum servile that had to be crushed with the maximum available force. Gellius and Lentulus received command of at least 2 legions each, which meant that Rome was mobilizing some 20,000 to 30,000 quality men to end the threat. The strategy was clear and simple. The 2 consuls were to coordinate their movements to trap Spartacus in a pincer, forcing him into a pitched battle, where Roman tactical superiority and training would ultimately prevail. The goal was not only to win but to annihilate the rebellion. Gellius's army had a victory over dissenting Gauls and Germans. While the consuls advanced, the internal dynamics of Spartacus's army began to show its first cracks, a problem that would be fatal to the revolt. The enormous rebel army was not monolithic but a coalition of different peoples with different objectives, and Spartacus's discipline could not control the thirst for loot of everyone. The first significant Roman victory in this war was achieved by the army of the consul Lucius Gellius Publicola, but it was a Pyrrhic victory in the sense that it did not occur against Spartacus. Instead, Gellius encountered a faction of Gauls and Germans under the command of Crixus, which had separated from the main body of the army. Crixus, Spartacus's lieutenant, was brave and fierce but lacked the long-term strategic vision of his leader. He and his followers, numbering some 30,000 men, a gigantic portion of the army, were more interested in immediate plunder and revenge than in the long and dangerous march to freedom that Spartacus planned. Disgusted by their leader's strict discipline and the prohibition of hoarding gold, they decided to break ranks and engage in plunder in the south. Gellius took advantage of this division with cunning. His legions, facing an enemy that fought with the fury of looting but without Spartacus's strategic discipline, achieved an overwhelming victory. The Gauls and Germans were decimated. The sources are not precise, but it is said that most of the 30,000 men of this faction were killed or captured in the combat that took place near Mount Gargano in southeastern Italy. This victory, although celebrated in Rome as a sign that the tide had turned, had a double edge. On the one hand, it demonstrated that the Roman legion, when well led, could crush any enemy. On the other hand, the victory was against a part of the army that Spartacus no longer wanted, leaving the Thracian leader with a smaller but more cohesive army, more loyal to his vision. Crixus's death, although a personal loss for Spartacus, was a confirmation that ideological purity and discipline were vital. And the Thracian would use this tragedy not only as a lesson but as a powerful act of propaganda for his own cause, an act that would demonstrate his absolute seriousness before Rome. Gellius's victory over a part of the rebellion marked the first major break in the Army of the Free, a division that was not only military. Deeply rooted ideological and ethnic divisions plagued the rebel army. The initial euphoria of their escape and early victories had masked fundamental differences in leadership, but as they marched through Italy, these simmering tensions finally erupted. From its inception, Spartacus's army was a coalition of necessity, a pact forged for mutual survival. Spartacus, the Thracian, envisioned a long-term goal: freedom beyond the borders of Italy. He understood that Rome was too powerful to conquer or subdue. His strategic plan always revolved around marching north, crossing the Alps, and returning his men to their homelands. This required unwavering discipline, constant mobility, and the sacrifice of immediate gains. However, for Crixus, the Gaul, and his substantial faction of Celtic and Germanic warriors, the objective was far more immediate and visceral. These men, who formed a significant portion of the initial force from Capua and Batiatus's Ludus, came from a warrior culture that prized plunder, direct confrontation, and swift vengeance. For them, simply being in Italy, plundering the riches of their former masters, represented the pinnacle of rebellion. Why march into the frigid Alps when they could revel in the warmth and wine of Italy, inflicting punishment upon the Romans? This more impetuous faction, less inclined towards Spartacus's strict discipline, had grown weary of their leader's restraint. They craved gold and battle. The tension became unbearable, and in a decision that would prove fatal to the rebellion, Crixus chose to break ranks. He separated from the main body of Spartacus's army, leading away approximately 30,000 men, predominantly Gauls and Germans. This split was not merely a tactical blunder. It represented a rejection of Spartacus's vision of pure freedom in favor of immediate vengeance and material gain. It was a moment of profound disappointment for Spartacus, as Crixus had been his comrade since their escape from Capua. However, his departure inevitably purified the main army, making it more loyal and disciplined, albeit numerically weaker. Crixus's decision quickly brought a swift and terrible price. His faction headed south, plundering the region of Apulia. The consul Lucius Gellius Publicola, who had been dispatched to crush the entire revolt, encountered this breakaway faction near Mount Gargano, in modern-day Gargano, along Italy's Adriatic coast. The ensuing battle validated Spartacus's strategic foresight. Without discipline, sheer numbers and fury were no match for the organized formations of the Roman legions. Crixus and his men fought with the courage of the desperate, but they lacked the maneuverability, formation, and coordination that Spartacus had striven to instill. Gellius, with his complete and well-organized legions, decimated the Gallic and Germanic faction. The annihilation was almost total. Sources recount Crixus's death in battle and the slaughter of the vast majority of his men. This battle marked Rome's first substantial victory in the war and perfectly illustrated the inherent weakness of an army solely reliant on the fury of plunder. Rome could celebrate the death of a rebel leader and the elimination of a significant portion of the slave army. But for Spartacus, the news was a bitter blend of personal grief over the loss of a comrade and a stark warning about the consequences of indiscipline. Upon learning of Crixus's annihilation, Spartacus was deeply affected. His reaction to his lieutenant's death represents one of the darkest and most controversial moments in his legend, revealing much about his complex character and the nature of his war. Spartacus had marched his main army northward, evading the other consul, Lentulus. While passing through regions near where Crixus had fallen, he captured 300 high-ranking Roman prisoners. With these prisoners, Spartacus orchestrated a funerary tribute to his fallen comrade, a ritual that left both Rome and his own men stunned. He forced the 300 Romans to fight to the death as gladiators in honor of Crixus. This act is a crucial point for analysis. Was it an act of Romanization or an act of brutal antagonism? A Romanizing interpretation. Spartacus, having been trained in the gladiatorial funerary tradition of Rome, was imitating the custom that had given rise to the munera, or gladiatorial games. He was honoring his comrade with the highest offering he knew, the blood of warriors. By forcing Romans to fight to the death, he was demonstrating that he had absorbed Roman virtus. He was essentially saying, "I can do this too, and I will do it to your leaders." An antagonistic, vengeful interpretation. This is perhaps the more potent reading. By forcing Roman citizens and nobles to assume the most degraded and humiliating role in their society, that of a gladiator, Spartacus completely inverted the social order. He was using the instrument of Roman oppression, the arena, against the oppressors themselves, turning spectators into victims. It was the ultimate symbol of revenge and the reversal of power. Those who once watched from the stands were now bleeding in the dust of the arena. The message was crystal clear. War has no rules, and the humiliation you inflicted upon us will be returned in kind. What remains clear is that the act was a masterful stroke of propaganda. It demonstrated the ferocity of Spartacus's leadership and solidified his moral authority within the army. If Spartacus was capable of making Romans bleed in such a manner, his men would follow him blindly. The sacrifice of the 300 Romans was the price paid for Crixus's indiscipline and Spartacus's public declaration that he, the Thracian slave, was now the master of Italy, at least temporarily, and that his war would be a brutal mirror of Roman cruelty. Having avenged the death of his comrade Crixus with the gruesome menace of 300 Romans, Spartacus wasted no time in lamenting or lingering in the south. He had purged his army of its most undisciplined elements and taught Rome a lesson about who held the upper hand. The path forward was the one his strategy had always dictated, the march north towards the only valid goal, freedom. The two consuls, Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, had set out to corner and crush Spartacus, but Gellius's annihilation of Crixus had freed the main army from their pincer movement. Lentulus, in particular, suffered a catastrophic humiliation. Spartacus, once again demonstrating his mastery of mobile warfare, avoided direct confrontation where the Romans wanted to fight. Instead, he employed a series of rapid maneuvers and surprise attacks. It is said that the consuls, while attempting to converge, were intercepted separately. Lentulus's army was ambushed and attacked with such ferocity that his legions were completely shattered and dispersed. The defeat was so decisive that the consul was forced to flee in disgrace. Shortly after, or perhaps concurrently with this disaster, Gellius Publicola's army, believing they had fulfilled their duty with the victory over Crixus, was also surprised and defeated by Spartacus's reinvigorated force, which had rearmed itself with captured weapons. Within a few weeks, the Thracian slave had achieved the unthinkable. He had defeated and scattered the consular armies of the entire Roman Republic. It was an unprecedented catastrophe on Italian soil. The two supreme leaders of Rome had been ridiculed by a gladiator. Despite these victories, Spartacus's path north remained fraught with danger. Rome, in its desperation, had dispatched one last bulwark. The governor of Cisalpine Gaul, Gaius Cassius Longinus, along with the praetor Gnaeus Manlius. Longinus encountered Spartacus near the city of Mutina, modern-day Medina. Longinus had a crucial mission: to prevent the rebels from crossing the Po River and leaving Italy at all costs. Leading an army that was again a mixture of legions and recruits, Longinus attempted to engage Spartacus. However, the rebels' momentum and skill were unstoppable. The Battle of Mutina ended in another resounding victory for Spartacus. Longinus's forces were completely defeated, and the governor himself narrowly escaped the battle, suffering public and political humiliation that would follow him for the rest of his life. Longinus's defeat was not just another victory. It was the elimination of the last significant military obstacle in the north. After Mutina, Spartacus's army had a completely open route to the Alps. Freedom was within reach. Just a few days' march away, the Republic had run out of first-rate generals in Italy and lacked an army capable of stopping the revolt. And here we arrive at the great paradox of the war, the moment when Spartacus, with total success within his grasp, turns around and heads back south. Having cleared Cisalpine Gaul and with the door to freedom wide open, why did the leader who had fought so desperately to escape Italy simply choose not to? This is the richest and most fascinating historical debate surrounding Spartacus. Sources propose several hypotheses that likely combined to influence this fateful decision. Pressure from his men. This is perhaps the strongest hypothesis. While Spartacus and the Thracian corps held the vision of freedom in their homelands, the majority of his 100,000+ followers were now Gauls, Germans, and Italic peoples. For many of them, the prospect of crossing cold and unfamiliar mountains to return to a homeland that may no longer exist was not as appealing as the immediate riches and temperate climate of southern Italy. The men were intoxicated by victory, and having defeated the consular armies, they may have believed they could conquer Rome itself. The pressure for continued plunder and the ambition for a larger conflict forced Spartacus to yield to the popular will of his army. Plan to rearm and regroup. Some historians suggest that Spartacus did not want his army to disperse immediately after crossing the Alps. He intended to use the southern regions of Italy, perhaps the fertile granary of Sicily, as a base of operations to fully rearm and possibly establish a trade or supply network before disbanding. His turn south may have been a logistical move, not an ideological one. Desire to challenge Rome or seek escape by sea. A more dramatic hypothesis suggests that Spartacus felt compelled to prove that he did not fear Rome. After the victory over Longinus, the Senate had no one left in Italy. His return south may have been an attempt to seek an escape route by sea, perhaps to Sicily, where a massive slave population existed and where revolts had previously succeeded. Indeed, Appian suggests he headed towards the ports of Rhegium and Brundisium. Whatever the reason, the decision to return south was the decisive strategic error of the Third Servile War. Spartacus let the moment of total victory pass, the moment when Rome was at its weakest, and he re-entered the geographical trap of the Italian peninsula, bringing his army back within reach of the inevitable reinforcements that Rome would bring from its foreign provinces. His ideal of freedom had been forced to bow before the ambition and lust for war of his own men, a concession that would cost him and his army their lives. Panic in Rome reached its zenith. Following the humiliation of the two consuls at the hands of a slave, the Republic realized that its very existence was in peril and that the war could not be won by mediocre generals or improvised militias. A figure with immense power was needed, the ambition to assume the risk, and, crucially, the wealth to finance a total war. The man who fulfilled these requirements in abundance was Marcus Licinius Crassus. Marcus Licinius Crassus, by 72 BC, was the wealthiest man in all of Rome, perhaps in the entire Mediterranean. But his wealth was not merely a sign of opulence, it was a tool of political and social power. Crassus was a homo novus of noble lineage, but his fortune was built astutely and ruthlessly, especially during Sulla's dictatorship. Following Sulla's victory over Marius's faction in the civil war, Crassus greatly profited from the proscriptions. Sulla published lists of his political opponents, and anyone on those lists could be legally murdered and their property confiscated. Crassus bought the properties of the executed and banished at ridiculously low prices, amassing a colossal fortune in real estate. His real estate and firefighting business was particularly notorious. When a house caught fire in populous Rome, Crassus didn't send his slave firefighters to extinguish the blaze, but to negotiate with the owner to buy the burning property at a bargain price. If the owner refused, he let the house burn to the ground. Then, with his engineers and hundreds of slave builders, he rebuilt the property, renting or selling it for a gigantic profit. He was a man with a business acumen as sharp as his political ambition. Crassus craved the military glory and public recognition that his rivals possessed, particularly the young and successful General Pompey the Great, who would soon return from Hispania as a hero. Spartacus's problem was the perfect opportunity for Crassus to demonstrate that he was not merely a man of money, but a general capable of saving the Republic from its most embarrassing threat. The Senate, desperate and seeing the specter of Spartacus looming over Rome, was forced to accept that Crassus was the only one capable of confronting the crisis without crippling the state treasury because he could finance the war himself. In early 71 BC, Crassus was appointed praetor, but with extraordinary military powers. In practice, he received a proconsular mandate in Italy, granting him supreme authority over all military forces in the peninsula. The Senate gave him a blank check and a mission: the total annihilation of Spartacus. Determined not to repeat the mistakes of Glaber and Lentulus, Crassus understood that the key lay in numerical superiority and the quality of troop. Using his vast fortune, he launched a massive recruitment drive. He was not content with militias. He needed a professional force. He recruited 6 to 8 new legions at his own expense, which, added to the consular legions of Gellius and Lentulus, which were decimated and demoralized, allowed him to assemble a formidable army of 10 legions. This translated into a combat force estimated at 40,000 to 50,000 well-equipped men, not counting auxiliary troop. It was a massive army, a force worthy of a civil war or a major foreign campaign. The scale of this mobilization was Rome's tacit acknowledgement that Spartacus was the most dangerous enemy the Republic faced at that moment. But Crassus's genius lay not only in the number of men but in the restoration of morale and discipline. Crassus knew that his legions were demoralized by previous defeat. His first task was not to find Spartacus, but to reform his own men, demonstrating that fear of the enemy should be replaced by a much greater fear, the fear of their own general. This would be the starting point of his iron discipline, a theme that would demonstrate that Crassus was not just buying glory, but was also willing to pay for it with the blood of his own soldiers if necessary. Marcus Licinius Crassus knew that his greatest enemy was not just Spartacus, but the fear and demoralization that had gripped his own troops after the successive defeats at the hands of the slaves. The army he inherited from the defeated consuls was, despite its numbers, a humiliated and cowardly force. Crassus understood that to restore Roman virtus, he had to apply a terror far greater and more immediate than that inspired by the Thracian terror of their own general. The act that defined Crassus's leadership, and which went down in history as the epitome of his cruelty and effectiveness, was the restoration of decimatio. This practice was a form of capital punishment so brutal and archaic that it had fallen into disuse centuries ago, reserved only for cases of extreme cowardice and mutiny. Crassus revived it to impose order. After suffering a small but humiliating defeat at the hands of Spartacus's rebels in their first engagements, where several Roman detachments fled in panic, Crassus decided that enough was enough. Decimatio consisted of killing 1 out of every 10 soldiers in a cohort or unit that had shown cowardice or indiscipline. The process was gruesome. The guilty unit was assembled and divided into groups of 10. Then, by lot, 1 man was chosen from each group. The remaining 9 were obligated to beat or stone their comrade to death. The logic was twofold. Not only were the cowardly elements eliminated and discipline restored through terror, but the surviving soldiers were forced to be the executioners of their own comrades. This ensured that from that moment on, each soldier's loyalty and fear were directed absolutely towards Crassus. Decimatio was the clearest possible statement of intent. It was safer for a Roman soldier to face Spartacus's sword than to risk the disciplinary wrath of Marcus Licinius Crassus. The application of Decimatio transformed Crassus's army radically. The praetor was not just playing with the lives of his men, but with their psychology. The effect was immediate and profound. The force that had previously scattered before an attack by slaves now marched with iron discipline and determination. The fear of Crassus's punishment became a more powerful incentive for combat than Roman honor itself. Recruits, who previously doubted their ability, now fought for survival, knowing that cowardice would be punished by their own friends. Crassus complemented this terror with logistical organization that only a man of his wealth could afford. He ensured that his 10 legions were well-fed, better paid, and better equipped than Spartacus's troops. This contrasted sharply with the misery and hunger often suffered by Roman armies on long campaigns. By providing comfort while instilling absolute terror, Crassus managed to transform defeated legions into a disciplined and fearsome force. This shift in morale was the true turning point of the war. No longer would they face the hungry Gauls and plunderers of Crixus, nor the poorly trained militias of Glaber, but a massive military body disciplined to the extreme and under the command of a man whose ambition for glory was so great that he would not hesitate to massacre his own to achieve it. The Servile War had changed hands. Spartacus no longer faced arrogance, but the brutal efficiency of the richest man in Rome. Spartacus's return towards southern Italy, the fatal decision he made after the Battle of Mutina, led him directly into the trap that Crassus was devising. The wealthiest praetor of Rome had not only restored discipline, but now he would deploy a stroke of engineering and military strategy that would demonstrate his logistical superiority. Spartacus's decision to abandon the open road to the Alps and march south had a clear purpose for the strategist: reaching Sicily. The island had been the scene of the 2 previous Servile Wars, and Spartacus saw it as a natural stronghold for slaves and an ideal base of operations. The slave population in Sicily was gigantic, and if they managed to cross the Strait of Messina, they could recruit an even larger army, fortify themselves on the island, and resume the fight from an impregnable position, further disrupting the vital grain supply to Rome. Despite his victories over the consuls, Spartacus understood that Crassus's army was a completely different threat. His goal was, therefore, to avoid confrontation at all costs and lead his men across the strait, the strip of sea separating the tip of the Italian peninsula from eastern Sicily. Crassus, however, was not a general who played cat and mouse. After chasing Spartacus across Italy and pushing him to the far south on the Calabrian peninsula, at the very tip of the boot, the praetor devised a strategy as simple as it was monumental: to trap them. The rebel army, in its desperation to cross to Sicily, found itself cornered in the region of Rhegium, the tip of Calabria, right across from Messina. Crassus then ordered the construction of a 55-kilometer-long wall, a wall that stretched from coast to coast, from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Ionian Sea, completely sealing off the peninsula. This engineering feat was a massive display of Crassus's power and wealth. His 10 legions, now fearful of Decimatio and experts in building camps, worked tirelessly. The fortification was not just a wall. It consisted of a deep ditch, said to be 4 meters wide, followed by an embankment topped with a wooden palisade, guard towers, and constant sentries. The message was unmistakable. Spartacus and his army were locked in the tip of Italy, with no access to the north and no way to cross south to Sicily. Crassus had built a gigantic cage with the intention of letting time and logistics do the dirty work. Crassus's plan was perfect in its brutality, transforming the Calabria Peninsula into a giant concentration camp and letting hunger break them. The rebels were trapped just in time for the winter of 71 BC. The situation inside the encirclement became desperate. The tip of Calabria was not a granary like Campania, it was a mountainous and poor region. Spartacus's immense army, numbering over 70,000 men, quickly exhausted local resources. Food shortages became the fiercest enemy, surpassing the Roman legions. They had to resort to desperate diets, eating roots, wild fruits, and, according to some sources, horse and dog meat on a rationed basis. The contrast between the rebel army, hungry and freezing, behind the palisades of their natural prison, and Crassus's army, well supplied and rotating its soldiers in guard shifts, could not have been more stark. Crassus knew he had the upper hand. While Spartacus despaired, Crassus remained patient, knowing that hunger, disease, and cold would do their work, forcing the Thracian slave to make a mistake. Crassus's wall was not just a physical obstacle, but an unbearable psychological pressure designed to undermine the spirit of the men who had fought so valiantly to escape that very peninsula. Trapped in the tip of Calabria, with Crassus's wall blocking the north and the sea to the south, Spartacus realized that time was running out and that Crassus's strategy of starving them was working. In an act of calculated desperation, he decided to gamble everything on a dangerous alliance. Okay, here's the English-US translation and rewrite of the provided Spanish text, with a touch of interpretive flair and minor expansions for clarity, as requested. Spartacus's situation was volatile. The Strait of Messina was, and still is, a vital chokepoint in the Mediterranean. Back then, it was swarming with Sicilian pirates. These pirates, originating from the region of Cilicia in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, were a formidable naval force. They were a constant thorn in Rome's side, even though Rome relied on them for the slave trade. The Romans both depended on and despised them for their raids on Roman ships. Spartacus, with a substantial amount of captured loot, managed to send emissaries to negotiate with the leaders of these pirate gangs. His proposal was simple and appealing to the pirates: a massive sum of money in exchange for a fleet of ships sufficient to transport his army, estimated at around 70,000 men, across the short distance of the strait to Sicily. This was a golden opportunity for the rebellion to escape and resume the war in a new theater. The pirates, always motivated by greed, accepted the deal. They received Spartacus's payment up front and swore to provide the necessary ships for the crossing. However, in a move that cemented their reputation for treachery, the Sicilian pirates absconded with the money. Sources say that after receiving payment, they either feared Rome's wrath if they helped such a large army escape, or they simply saw an easier profit in keeping the money without risking their lives. The fact remains: the ships never arrived, leaving Spartacus and his hungry, desperate army stranded and betrayed at the tip of Italy, with Crassus tightening the noose from the north. This logistical failure, fueled by pirate avarice, sealed the fate of the rebel army. With the pirates' betrayal and Crassus's wall preventing their escape, Spartacus faced a dilemma of total annihilation. He had to try to break the siege, and he did so using a combination of deception, ingenuity, and exploiting the natural conditions. Crassus's ditch and wall were formidably guarded, but Spartacus planned his escape for a night of blizzard or, at least, severe weather, when visibility would be near zero and the Roman guard would be less alert. His tactic of deception was both brilliant and macabre. To prevent the Roman sentinels from realizing that the army was moving, Spartacus ordered large bonfires to be lit in the camp. To give the impression that the camps were still crowded and the army was calm, he ordered that the bodies of dead prisoners, sick slaves, and livestock be placed next to the bonfires. This kept the Roman sentinels believing the camp was full of life, unaware that a massive evacuation was underway in the darkness. The real challenge, however, was crossing the ditch. Plutarch recounts that in the midst of the storm, Spartacus had his men cover part of the ditch with earth, logs, and bundles of branches, or fasces. Some more dramatic accounts suggest they used frozen bodies and snow to create a makeshift bridge over the trench. Crossing these improvised bridges, Spartacus's army managed to traverse Crassus's wall, evading the surveillance of the 10 legions. Although the escape was successful, it came at a cost and was a feat of enormous difficulty. This breach of the siege demonstrated one thing: the discipline of the slaves, fueled by desperation, surpassed even the engineering and discipline imposed by the wealthiest man in Rome. Spartacus had managed to escape the encirclement, but now he found himself once again on the Italian peninsula with a hungry army, winter bearing down on them, and Crassus, furious at the humiliation, relentlessly pursuing them. The escape from the wall wasn't salvation, it was merely the prelude to the final battle. After the dramatic escape from the Calabrian trap, Spartacus found himself free again, but his situation was more precarious than ever. His army was exhausted and hungry, and although he had evaded the encirclement, the strategic error of having returned south now relentlessly haunted him. The war was entering its final phase, marked by rebel desperation and the Roman generals' boundless ambition. The escape from Crassus's wall showed that Spartacus's primary objective hadn't changed: to escape Italy. Upon leaving Calabria, the Thracian leader didn't head north again toward the Alps, but southeast to the province of Apulia. His new target was the port of Brundisium, modern-day Brindisi. Brundisium was one of Italy's most important ports, the main departure point for voyages to Greece and the East. Spartacus was betting that if he arrived in time, he could confiscate or negotiate for a fleet large enough to cross the Adriatic Sea and land his men in some eastern province beyond the immediate reach of the Republic. The port offered a last, desperate hope of escape by sea. The march to Brundisium, therefore, was not a campaign of plunder, but a race against time and logistics. Spartacus pushed his men to the limit, seeking to reach the coast before the Romans could block the route. However, fate was already working against him. The region they were crossing was precisely the one that Consul Gellius had cleared when defeating Crixus, meaning fewer opportunities for recruitment and fewer local supplies. As Spartacus hurried toward Brundisium, the Senate, now out of patience and terrified that the slave might reach the coast and escape, made the most dramatic decision of the war: to summon their most successful generals from abroad. The Senate ordered Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, the young hero and popular general, to return immediately from Hispania, where he had just achieved victory in a long and difficult war. At the same time, Lucius Licinius Lucullus was also summoned from Asia, although his arrival would take longer. This decision had an electrifying effect on Marcus Licinius Crassus. He had spent a personal fortune, imposed the dreaded decimation, and engineered the brilliant Calabrian trap. Crassus had done all the hard work and now faced political humiliation. The possibility that his rivals, Pompey or Lucullus, would arrive in Italy, deliver the final blow, and steal all the glory of the victory was unbearable. Roman law dictated that the general who led the troops during the final battle received the honor of the triumph, not the one who had done the preliminary work. For Crassus, the war against Spartacus ceased to be a mission for the Republic and became a personal race for glory. He understood that he had to win and annihilate Spartacus before Pompey arrived and claimed credit for crushing the rebellion. The pressure on Crassus became unbearable, transforming him from a patient, methodical general into a furious, hasty pursuer. Spartacus, meanwhile, found himself in a deadly pincer. Not only did he have Crassus pursuing him from the rear with a disciplined and massive army, but now approaching from the Adriatic was Lucullus's army, blocking the route to Brundisium. To the north were Pompey's troops ready to disembark. Spartacus's last chance at Brundisium vanished, and the fate of his army was sealed. Flight was impossible, and the only option left was the final battle. The drama of the Third Servile War was inexorably heading toward a brutal climax. Marcus Licinius Crassus, terrified by the imminent arrival of his rivals, Pompey and Lucullus, launched into a full pursuit. Spartacus, blocked in Brundisium by Lucullus's newly landed army, had no choice but to turn back. He was cornered between three Roman forces, and in the region of Lucania, near the Salaris River, the fate of the revolt was decided. The rebel army that reached the Salaris was not the imposing, disciplined force that had humiliated consuls. It was a weakened, hungry, and, once again, divided force. Internal tensions, exacerbated by hunger and desperation, resurfaced. A significant portion of the rebels, tired of the discipline and hunger imposed by Spartacus, broke away to attempt a last, vain looting on their own. This faction was quickly intercepted and massacred by Crassus's legions. This final split was the last straw for Spartacus. He realized that he could no longer hold his army together, nor could he continue to evade Crassus. Their fate was sealed. Crassus's strategy of exhausting the rebels through starvation and psychological pressure had worked. Spartacus was forced into a frontal battle on terrain chosen by the enemy. The only type of combat he had always tried to avoid was the final battle, a confrontation where numerical superiority, and above all, the brutally restored discipline of Crassus, would have the final say. Before the massive assault of Crassus's legions began, Plutarch gifts us with one of the most powerful and defining moments of the Spartacus legend, a gesture that illustrates his resolve in the face of imminent death. According to the account, when his horse was brought to him, the noble Thracian drew his sword and, in full view of his men, killed it. This act, which might seem illogical for a general who needed mobility, was laden with meaning. Seeing the astonishment of his lieutenants, Spartacus declared, "If we win this battle, victory will give us many better horses, but if we lose, I won't need any." This act was a declaration of total, irreversible war. It was a solemn promise to his army that he would fight to the end, shoulder to shoulder, with no possibility of escape. By killing his horse, Spartacus stripped himself of the symbol of a leader who could flee and embraced the destiny of a warrior. It was a way of saying to every man, "Either we all save ourselves or we all die here." This gesture cemented the final loyalty of the thousands of men who were preparing to fight against death with desperation as their only ally. The Battle of the Salaris River was a bloodbath. Spartacus's army fought with the fury of men who knew they had nothing to lose. The battle was fierce and prolonged, but the difference in training, equipment, and morale of Crassus's legions, now fighting with the fear of decimation hanging over them, was insurmountable. The climax of the combat was the desperate charge led by Spartacus himself, with inevitable defeat looming over his forces. The Thracian leader made a final decision. Instead of directing the battle from the rear, he launched himself to the front, making a final, reckless attempt to reach Marcus Licinius Crassus himself. Spartacus, riding or marching on foot at that moment, managed to penetrate several lines of combat, opening a path through the pulse of the battle. Sources indicate that he killed 2 Roman centurions who stood in his way. His goal wasn't tactical victory, but the assassination of the Roman general, a blow that could have changed the course of history if it had succeeded. If Spartacus killed Crassus, panic would seize the Roman army, and the revolt might have been saved once again. However, despite his heroic onslaught, the tide of the legions was too strong. Spartacus never managed to reach Crassus. His charge was blocked by the bulk of the legions moving in disciplined formation. Surrounded and overwhelmed, Spartacus was finally cut down. The mystery of his death remains, as his body was never found. Plutarch recounts that the Thracian leader fell covered in wounds, fighting to the last breath. The fact that the Romans couldn't recover his body to display it in Rome only added to his legend, allowing history to suggest that Spartacus, the slave who defied the Republic, vanished into the anonymity of history just as he had arrived, leaving only the trail of Roman blood he had shed. The Battle of the Salaris was the end of the revolt, but not the end of the story. Spartacus's charge at the Battle of the Salaris was the last gasp of the Third Servile War. Once the Thracian leader fell, organized resistance crumbled, and the contained fury of Crassus's legions was unleashed in a brutal and systematic massacre. The fall of the leader was witnessed by many, but his final fate remains a mystery that only intensifies his legend. Spartacus died fighting. Plutarch, who is the most detailed, describes how, despite being wounded in the thigh by a javelin, he knelt and, holding his shield, continued to fight with unheard of ferocity, surrounded by enemies. Finally, he fell next to a pile of Romans he had killed. Appian describes him as a man who made his way into the thick of the battle to Crassus's line, but did not reach him, and then died valiantly. The most important fact is that his body was never found. In the chaos of battle, among the mass of bodies and mud, the Thracian leader's corpse could not be identified or recovered by the Romans. Crassus was deprived of the ultimate war trophy, displaying the body of the slave who had humiliated Rome. This physical absence is what allows the myth of Spartacus to live on so strongly, because the slave, who had rejected the Roman definition of his existence, also rejected the tomb and the final Roman dishonor. There was no head displayed or body dragged in the triumph, only the confirmation of his heroic death. With the fall of their general, the rebel army became a disorganized mass of terrified men. What followed was a total massacre. Crassus's legions, who had feared these slaves for almost 2 years and had suffered the shame of decimation, showed no mercy. The goal wasn't surrender, but total annihilation, a lesson of terror for the rest of the slave population of Italy. It's estimated that more than 60,000 rebels died on the battlefield or were executed immediately afterward. The figure is chilling. The annihilation was so complete that only a handful of thousands of fugitives managed to escape the initial slaughter, scattering through the forests and mountains of Lucania, seeking impossible individual salvation. Crassus had fulfilled the promise he had made to the Senate. Spartacus's revolt had been physically eliminated. Just as Crassus was clearing the battlefield of the Salaris, and before he could consolidate his triumph, the shadow of his rival, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, appeared. Pompey, returning from his victorious campaign in Hispania, encountered a force of about 5,000 dispersed rebel fugitives attempting to march north. His fresh, veteran legions quickly captured or massacred them. Pompey's action was a masterstroke of political self-promotion and a blatant humiliation for Crassus. Pompey sent a message to Rome, and essentially to the Senate, proclaiming that while Crassus had won the great battle, Pompey had ripped out the roots of the war by eliminating the last organized portion of the rebels. This allowed him to claim for himself part of the credit for ending the Servile War. Crassus, the man who had invested his fortune and risked his career, was forced to share his glory with a rival who had really only swept up the leftovers of the banquet. The deep and mutual envy between Crassus and Pompey, sown at that moment of grudgingly shared victory, would be fundamental in the power plays that led to the formation of the First Triumvirate. The military defeat of Spartacus wasn't enough to satisfy the thirst for revenge and the fear of the Roman Republic. Rome's reaction was a display of calculated cruelty, designed to erase the humiliation and engrave in the minds of every slave the absolute futility of rebellion. The most horrendous and memorable act of Roman repression was the mass, public execution of prisoners. Crassus couldn't allow even one of the thousands of captured slaves to return to the latifundia with the idea that rebellion was possible. Therefore, he ordered the crucifixion of 6,000 prisoners along the main road connecting southern Italy to the capital. The row of crosses stretched for more than 200 kilometers along the Appian Way, from Capua, the starting point of the revolt, to the gates of Rome. This execution wasn't quick. Crucifixion was a form of slow, public torture, designed to prolong suffering and agony. 4 days, travelers heading to Rome passed by this endless line of dying bodies, a macabre forest of human suffering. Crassus's intention in ordering this atrocity wasn't just punishment. It was a state policy to suppress future rebellions. The crosses on the Appian Way served as an eternal and visible reminder that Rome would punish rebellion with a cruelty that would exceed any suffering inflicted by slavery. The image of the Appian Way, filled with rotting and agonizing bodies, was how Rome restored its dignitas. It was intended to terrorize the slave population so that they would never again contemplate the idea of armed freedom. Roman cruelty was displayed here in its coldest and most efficient form, using death as a pedagogical tool to guarantee the social and economic peace that depended on the slave system. The end of the war had repercussions that resonated far beyond the plains of Lucania, affecting Rome's internal politics and attitudes toward slavery. The victory over Spartacus immediately became a political weapon for its generals. Crassus had done the heavy lifting, but Pompey, by finishing the war by crushing the fugitives, claimed an undeserved share of the glory, increasing the tension between the two men. Both returned to Rome thirsty for power and recognition. The Senate, fearing to give too much power to either of them, was reluctant to grant them everything they asked for. This resistance, however, only managed to unite the rivals. In the end, the unbridled ambition of Crassus and the military popularity of Pompey combined, and together with a third man, Julius Caesar, they formed the First Triumvirate in 60 BC. This unofficial alliance of the three most powerful men in Rome was the tipping point that would ultimately undermine the Republic and lead it to civil war. The victory over Spartacus paradoxically engendered the coalition that would dismantle the political system that had fought it. Although the revolt was crushed, the lingering fear of the ghost of Spartacus settled in the hearts of the Roman landowning class. The terror of a new rebellion influenced the treatment and laws regarding slavery. Some measures were taken, although they were often cosmetic. Attempts were made to slightly improve the most basic living conditions of the slaves to reduce desperation, and surveillance in the latifundia became stricter. The use of ergastulo was more openly condemned. Nevertheless, the slave system continued to be the basis of the economy, but the elite remained permanently alert to any sign of insubordination or leadership among their slaves. The trauma of Spartacus was a sociological factor that kept the slave population in check, although the causes of the revolts remained intact. The Servile War wasn't the cause of the fall of the Republic, but a virulent symptom of its deep internal crisis. The revolt exposed the fatal weaknesses of the system. Social injustice and the massive, brutal slavery in the latifundia was a social time bomb. The incompetence of the Senate, its inability to take the initial threat seriously, and its final dependence on men with personal ambition, Crassus and Pompey, demonstrated the bankruptcy of its leadership and the power of the general. The crisis demonstrated that only a rich and ambitious general, willing to use his personal power, could resolve a crisis in Italy. This reinforced the idea that the solution to Rome's problems wasn't in the Senate, but in military force concentrated in a single man, paving the way toward the end of the Republic and the advent of dictatorship and empire. Although defeated and crucified, the story of Spartacus didn't end on the Appian Way. His figure transcended antiquity to become an immortal symbol of the fight against oppression. The story of the gladiator who fought for freedom was rediscovered and used as a revolutionary ideal throughout modern history. The Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers of the 17th and 18th centuries saw him as a defender of natural rights and human dignity. Marxism in the 19th and early 20th centuries, Spartacus was adopted by socialist and communist thought as the archetype of the proletarian who rises up against the oppressor. In Germany, the Spartacus League was a radical political group that helped found the German Communist Party. Liberation movements his figure has been used by countless liberation and resistance movements, from slave rebellions in the Caribbean to anti-colonial struggles. Spartacus became historical proof that even the most oppressed have the courage and intellectual capacity to challenge absolute power. Spartacus's cultural legacy cemented his mythical status. Howard Fast's historical novel, written in 1951, revitalized his story for the modern era, transforming it into a plea against oppression and totalitarianism. But it was the 1960 film adaptation, Spartacus, that engraved his figure in the global consciousness. Directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring Kirk Douglas, the film is a Hollywood epic that, although romanticized and with historical licenses, perfectly captured the spirit of the struggle for freedom. The high point of the film, where hundreds of men rise to proclaim, "I am Spartacus," is a powerful testament to the human desire for freedom, an echo of the terror that the Thracian inspired in Rome. In this way, the Thracian gladiator, whose body wasn't found, became the greatest fighter for freedom in ancient history. His defeat was military, but his victory was symbolic. The man that Rome tried to erase from history with a row of crosses earned an imperishable place as the universal symbol of rebellion. I hope you enjoyed this story and that it helped you relax while listening to a bit of good history. This is the Night Historian, your faithful companion for your sleepless night. If you liked the story, leave your good like and subscribe to become part of this nocturnal and cultured community. I want you to comment on what other topic you would like us to talk about in a future video. We read each comment carefully. Thank you for listening. Until the next adventure.